Hey there, welcome back to the podcast. This is Phil Vischer. This is the Holy Post Podcast. I am here with Christian Taylor.
Hello, Phil.
Hi, Christian. And Sky Jitani.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Sky. And Jason Rugg. Hi, Jason.
I didn't hit record on Zoom. Hold on.
Oh,
I gotta do it again. Sorry, that's my bad.
Hey there, this is Phil Vischer. Welcome back to the Holy Post Podcast. I am here with Christian Taylor.
Hello, Phil.
Hi, Christian. And Sky Jitani.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Sky. And Jason Rugg.
Hey there.
Hi, Jason, who forgot to press record the first time we started.
Ooh, we're good now.
We only got, a half an hour in and did some of the best material we've ever done and had to throw it away and start over again.
Do-overs are the best. And I learned that because I was watching City Slickers again last night. I don't know if you've seen City Slickers in a long time, but if you haven't,
I have not.
Go back because it is it's so good.
It's a
so
great movie.
Good. Yeah.
Wait, what was the do-over?
So they all really need a do-over in their life.
Oh, okay. Right. I'm with you. So everyone who's wrestling with the concept of redemption and grace, go watch City Slickers.
And then
because
have a do-over.
What's his name says, I crap bigger than you, I believe is the best
Curly.
line. Curly. Yeah. Curly. Okay. And here's the theme song. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Christian. Okay, I got some really, really big news.
Really?
We have a new record. A Belgian racing pigeon flies past the record in the auction.
Oh my goodness. What does that mean?
We have a new record, a new world record for the price of a Belgian racing pigeon at auction. A 2-year-old Belgian racing pigeon called New Kim.
What happened to the old Kim?
You don't want to know. You don't want to know what happened to old Kim. His navigation abilities were not fantastic.
Does it matter that the pigeon is Belgian?
Sky.
Is there a difference between a Belgian pigeon and a French or German pigeon or a Dutch pigeon? They're all in the same region.
I'll get to that.
Oh, okay.
All you need to know right now is a 2-year-old Belgian racing pigeon called New Kim has set a world record after being sold for, get this, $1.9 million.
Wow.
At an auction. What is the most, Sky? What's the most you've ever paid for a pigeon?
I have never paid for a pigeon. I am so well known now that people just give me pigeons for free.
The most interesting pigeon I've ever seen was in the Utah Beach Museum where, I guess it was just a picture, but they had the parachute. So they put, parachute.
Pigeons with parachutes?
Yeah. Well, and they had the pigeons would have messages taped to little
carrier pigeons.
Yeah.
Who are now extinct. We can never send a carrier pigeon again.
Really?
Yeah.
I never really understood how
Aren't they called carrier pigeons just because they carry stuff? Can't you stick anything on a pigeon and it'll carry it?
No, the others will chew it right off their leg.
Are they
all other pigeons is like, I'm not doing this.
They're not union, that's why.
They're homing pigeons. So these are Belgian racing pigeons. New Kim was only 2 years old and only raced in 2018, but he earned the title of Best Young Bird in Belgium.
Sounds pretty cool.
How long does a pigeon live?
I longed to earn that title at some point in my life. And
Best young pigeon?
Best young bird in Belgium.
Oh.
I never even got close. And it prompted an early retirement. Pigeons can typically breed until about 10 years old. So New Kim has many years of chicks ahead. Bidding started at €200 on November 2nd. That's where it started. I got a pigeon, €200. So $250 or something like that. Promptly rose to €1.31 million from a South African group within 90 minutes. And then 2 wealthy Chinese collectors fought it out through Sunday and ended up at €1.32 million, which is $1.9 million.
So if I understand this correctly, they are bidding to get this pigeon to breed it.
Yes.
It's going to go out to stud, basically.
Yes, the pigeon at the tender age of 2 is going out to stud, and the little chicklets will be sold. I remember chiclets; those were good, little gum. The little chiclets will be sold, and apparently, so a Chinese enthusiasm for long distance racing of homing pigeons has driven prices up sharply.
Is that like the Chinese equivalent of Uber Eats, where they just send the pigeon directly to your house and you just throw it in the fryer and then it's good to go?
No. I was thinking a pigeon with it.
Guy, you have no heart. You have no heart.
Because they eat pigeons and stuff. Remember the COVID wet market and all that, bats and whatnot?
Yeah, I was thinking a pigeon carrying a noodle.
No, I was thinking the pigeon itself. It's a to-go meal.
I need a noodle. Bring me a noodle. Birds from the traditional heartland of the sport in Belgium are particularly prized by Chinese enthusiasts.
Is this the Belgian pastime? Is pigeon racing?
No other country has such a high concentration of pigeon enthusiasts as Belgium.
You know what else they have? Waffles.
What?
Chocolate.
Waffles. That's right. Do the pigeons like waffles?
It's like they're chicken and waffles. They do pigeon and waffles.
So here's the good.
It's a delicacy.
What is this? All this podcast is going to be about? I mean, seriously, how much time have we spent talking about stupid pigeons?
Apparently none, because I forgot to start the timer. So we haven't spent any time on this at all. No, actually, 5 minutes. We spent 5 minutes. But here's the encouraging part. Because we hear all this bad news about the pandemic and about layoffs and people don't have jobs and people don't have money. Isn't it nice to know there's still enough money left in the world that someone can spend almost $2 million on a pigeon?
No. Did you not hear? Did Dolly Parton donated like $1 million to help develop the vaccine for the?
I know that could have gone for half a pigeon.
Or the pigeon could have gone to funding the vaccine. Why are you buying a pigeon for $2 million when we need a global vaccine to end the pandemic?
Clearly,
Dolly's got that taken
$4 million.
The only justification for this expenditure is if those Chinese investors breed so many pigeons that they plan on putting vials of vaccine on their legs and sending them out throughout the world to spread the vaccine.
You know, the vaccines have to be kept at like 70 degrees below zero.
Well, those are going to be some
one of them.
Stiff
Only
pigeons.
the
One of
Pfizer one.
Yeah, the other one's like 30 degrees below zero. It's
one of the last vaccine guy that came out, or group that came out, they said their vaccine was 70%. Dude, why are you going to even release it? Who's going to want the vaccine that's 70%?
Right,
we're now 95.
We can do way better than that. But I would like to see pigeons with tiny freezers on their legs and a dose of a vaccine in the tiny freezer flying all over America. Wouldn't that be great?
That might cheer people up.
I want to know why on earth...
My pigeon is here. My pigeon is here. I'm going to be okay.
I want to know why on earth the national pastime of Belgium is pigeon racing. And what does that look like? What is that spectator? Do they have stands of people as pigeons go flying by?
Yeah. And it's long distance pigeon racing. So
pigeons,
how far do they go?
Could solve so many problems in the pandemic. If we could bring them back, we wouldn't have to go anywhere. We could use those pigeons to bring things to us. And then we just wouldn't
like other pigeons.
Yes.
Pigeons are just like medieval drones.
Yes.
That's all now we have drones that are going to be dropping Amazon packages and things.
Yes, but pigeons are more, they're organic.
I'm contributing to this discussion. This has got to stop.
We've sucked you in.
You've sucked me in.
Hey, it wasn't news of the butt. That's all I can say about that.
Okay, well, what's next?
I just thought it was extraordinary.
News of the bird.
In such a trying time as this, there are still people that are so completely disconnected from the realities of Earth that they'll drop $2 million. For a bird you could buy a dozen of in Central Park for a nickel.
How do these Chinese investors know that when the bird arrives, it's actually
the bird? Is this
New
the
Kim?
bird?
Because pigeons, I can't tell them apart. Can you tell them apart? Why can't they just
send them
any pigeon?
You should sell them the pigeon and then send them one of the swearing parrots from last week's story. Here's your $2 million pigeon.
Phil, you realize now
you.
two consecutive weeks we've had bird news.
We're going to have a new segment.
News of the bird. Okay. Next story. Carl Lentz and the hot pastor problem. I assume everybody's heard about this.
I haven't, so fill me
Carl
in.
Lentz. Okay. Carl Lentz is the pastor of Hill Spring, New York.
No, Hillsong.
Sorry. What's Hill Spring? That's not a thing.
Oh, I have heard about this.
Yes, Hillsong, New York. He was kind of a celebrity pastor to Justin Bieber and a bunch of other people. Grew really big, and he's kind of, people say, hey, he's kind of hot. But he's definitely a hipster. He's a hipster pastor, and he just a couple of weeks ago flamed out with a marital affair and got fired by Hillsong. So our friend Katelyn Beaty, who's been on the show numerous times, wrote a piece called Carl Lentz and the Hot Pastor Problem, which on Twitter inspired other people to say, Katelyn, are you saying you find him hot? Because I don't think he's that hot, which was a kind of a sidebar conversation. He does sport hipster glasses that are similar to the ones that I was wearing in high school in 1982, in that they're large.
Yes, they are. I was joking with Katelyn, she's an old colleague of mine from CT, when she put that up and people were giving her grief about she thinks that Carl Lentz is hot. And she said, no, actually my type is more like this. And she put up a picture of the cop from Stranger Things. What's his name?
Oh, yeah. The big guy from
Hopper?
Stranger Things.
Hopper. Yeah. And I said, Katelyn, if this is your type, why did you leave the Midwest? And she lives in Brooklyn now. So like you're kind of limiting your options if this is what you wanted.
Yeah, there aren't a whole lot of Hopper types in Brooklyn. There are hipper types, but not Hopper types.
Not hipper hoppers.
She says, maybe the problem isn't hot pastors like Lentz, but a toxic megachurch culture that makes narcissism a prerequisite. So Sky, you had to get out of the pastorate because so many women were drawn to you.
Yeah, I'm kind of the poster boy for the hot pastor problem.
Because of your hotness. So do you think he should have followed your lead and also left?
For you people that are out there listening, I just want to clarify, they are being sarcastic. This is not true.
Hey, I take that as an insult.
This is not true. There were not Sky is always faithful. He always has been. There are not women chasing after him.
Women don't even like him. They find him a little bit disgusting. So
he's bald after all. I mean, what can I say?
Yes, I am. Okay, wait a minute. First of all,
what do we learn? Sky, help us out.
I like Katelyn a lot. I love her writing. I think she's thoughtful and brilliant. But do we really have a hot pastor problem? Because I don't know that that's a thing.
Okay, I think. Okay, well, let's distill it down to a simpler level.
Do not diss her. Clearly, it's a thing because she wrote an article about it.
Yeah. Well, so it must be true.
Well, it is a thing.
Phil has talked endlessly about news of the butt, and it's not a thing.
It is a thing. It has become a thing. It is.
I have much news of the butt. It is a thing.
Okay, whatever.
So when was the last time you saw a successful pastor that was, you would say, unattractive? Because she starts with just, the line from, is it Isaiah that, it says the Messiah, no one was drawn to his features. He was basically saying that the only thing the Bible says about Jesus' appearance,
he had no beauty or majesty that we should be attracted to him.
Yes, so he wasn't hot.
Well, I have been to churches where my pastors were not hot.
Were they big, thriving, successful churches? I don't think so.
Well, first of all, and this gets back into what we talked about years ago, Phil, and the difference between male and female gender types and things like that. But men can get away being ugly if they're really talented or really successful. And unfortunately, there's a double standard for women funny, but there's a double standard for women where there's an expectation they have to be visibly beautiful.
Yes.
To be in the public eye and affirmed and esteemed and all that. But I mean, I don't know. Beauty's in the eye of the beholder. I don't know if I could identify a pastor. I mean, who wants to name names here of pastors we think are ugly?
Yeah, let's name your top 5 ugliest pastors.
But okay, let me just say
Jason, you go first.
There are a number of very, very successful megachurch pastors who I do not think conform to the standards of masculine beauty. You
don't think Rick Warren is a hot pastor?
Yeah, I think he's gifted and talented in other ways that make him very admirable and attractive to people.
Tim Keller is not a hot pastor.
Yeah.
Well,
So Dallas Willard wasn't a pastor, but he's not a hot pastor.
No.
So okay. So do you think this is a false rabbit trail that we're hopping down, that we have a hot pastor problem?
I think I would expand. I'll give Katelyn credit for this. I think the title of the article was brilliant because it gets people clicking and reading. And maybe the editors came up with it, or I don't know. But I think her larger point is dead on, which is we expect our spiritual leaders to have attributes that the general culture thinks are fantastic, even if they're irrelevant to whether or not they're truly a spiritual leader, right?
Yeah.
So the Apostle Paul lists all kinds of great qualities like gentleness, not a lover of money, a long track record of faithfulness, able to teach, some of these other qualities, which have nothing to do with what the world necessarily esteems. But what we want are pastors and church leaders who are maybe physically attractive, dynamic speakers on a platform,
Right.
brilliantly intelligent and quick-witted.
But
go on down the list.
That goes back to your whole theory of the sermon-centric Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Yeah, we want a performer. We want someone who's a performer.
But we also like, think about, high school and middle school. You want to hang out with the good-looking kids because it makes you feel like you must be one of them. It's like, man, I want to be at that lunch table. And so I think people can look at churches the same way. It's like, I want to hang out with the good-looking people because it makes me feel better about myself. And I don't know how you avoid that. But people, particularly mega churches, when it became like Willow Creek at one point, was everyone who went on stage at Willow Creek had to go to a color advisor first who knew whether they were dressing in accord with their colors, spring, autumn, winter, fall. You actually had to have a color consultant before you could get on stage.
I didn't know that. That's kind of weird.
Yeah.
What this reminds me of is when I was a college student at a secular university, I was a part of a large campus ministry. And one fall when we came back on campus, some of the leaders of that ministry were telling us their strategy for the year was, we want to go after the most influential people on campus with the gospel. We want to talk to, the student athletes and the most popular teachers. And if we can get some of them to be a part of our ministry, then it's going to attract a bunch of other people for that same reason you're mentioning, Phil, like the cool kid table, essentially.
Right.
And what was interesting is my roommate and I, who was also a believer, the only person that we saw come to faith that year was the 50-something-year-old woman who lived in town who cleaned the bathroom in our dorm, who was at the very bottom of the totem pole socially, right, on a college campus. Like, you don't get lower than the townie who's cleaning the bathroom. She was going through a divorce. Her life was falling apart. Our room was right across from the bathroom, and she used to talk to us in the hallway all the time. And my friend Dave kind of developed a rapport with her and was caring about her, prayed for her. She's the one who ended up coming to faith in Christ that year, not any of the superstars on campus. And I think looking back on that, it fit what you see in the Gospels. I mean, there were some powerful and influential people who came to follow Christ, but for the most part, it was the marginalized and the riffraff.
That makes me think of two things that touched me this week and made me think. One was something on Twitter where an African-American woman said, white Christians, do you want to experience a diverse church? Stop seeking diversity. And why don't you go and join an African-American church? That was one thing.
I saw that too.
And I thought, that was a real challenge to me. Like, why isn't that our first thought, that we will go and look for a church and help be part of the diversity? That's one thing. And the second thing was, I watched Peanut Butter Falcon this week. Have you guys seen that movie?
No.
Okay,
I know what it is.
Phenomenal, and I encourage you to watch it. But it is about this Down syndrome boy who everybody has, put down and marginalized and forgotten. And it's his journey of discovering, of others discovering his value and then him feeling valued. And in watching that, I thought of my own son, who was just totally made fun of all through high school and beyond. And it took my other son to say, you are not what everyone is telling you. You are something much better. And I think it is going to be up to us to decide, what we value and and begin to focus on things that the world is not focusing on. We have to think differently as Christians, and we have to look at people differently, the ones that are the outcasts, and purposefully build relationships with those, you know?
So, okay, so two churches are launched. One is launched by Rick Moranis. The other is launched by Jason Momoa. Which one grows faster?
Well, probably Jason Momoa's.
I don't even know who he is.
You don't know Jason Momoa? Aquaman?
Aquaman.
He was the Khal Drago, whatever, in Game of Thrones.
So
Khal Drago.
Was it Khal? What was his name?
Khal Drago.
Khal, whatever. I know Khal.
Khal Drago. So if they were both pastors, unless, Rick Moranis was really, really funny and engaging, people are going to be drawn to Jason Momoa. That's just
right.
So how do you avoid that? How do you even if his preaching is shallow?
You've identified the problem, and the problem is us. We are all that way. We are naturally drawn. It's
drawn
in our
to
DNA.
Shiny things.
So wait, let me offer a positive outlook rather than just we're all terrible here.
Yes, Guy.
I think I've told this story before, but one of the first times I met Dallas Willard was at a ministry conference years ago. I think it was in San Diego. And I was there with my boss at the time, Marshall Shelley, who was older than me and really experienced and knew kind of the ministry world really well. And we were going down the hallway in this resort. They had all these breakout rooms, basically. And we were poking our heads into these different rooms to see which breakout session we were going to go into to report on for Leadership Journal. And there were like big name celebrity pastors at the time were there, like, what's his name? Mark Driscoll was there, and Rob Bell may have been there.
Hot pastors.
Hot young pastors, right? And we poke our head into the room.
Skinny jeans.
We poke our head into the room where Dallas Willard was doing his breakout session. And it was so packed, we couldn't even get into the room. Like, people were sitting on the floor around the podium. Needed a lubricant to get another person in that room. It was so crowded. So we couldn't get in, and so we get out, and Marshall says to me, I don't get it. Like, why? There's all these cool young pastors here, all these really successful church leaders. Why is everyone packing into Dallas Willard's room when Dallas was older? He's not a flashy presenter. He's not a church leader or a mega church leader by any means. What is it about Dallas Willard that has everybody flocking to him? And the best I could come up with at the time was just Dallas Willard smelled like Jesus. Like, he just dripped the fruit of the Spirit. It was so authentic and real. And I think there was such desperation for that in people that they wanted to be closer to it. And you had these other folks there who had mega churches and were selling tons of books and were super dynamic on a platform. But I don't think, some of them may have been fine people, but I don't think they had enough life experience and track record of faithfulness and they just hadn't walked with Jesus long enough to have it rub off on them the way it did with Dallas. So I think you're right, Christian. We do get attracted to these ridiculous things at times, but notice that it only really works if you keep them at a distance or on a pedestal. When you get really close to some of those superstars, they don't smell like Jesus. They don't look like Jesus. They don't have that. And that's where it falls to pieces.
That's true. And I do want to clarify one thing. I was not saying we are the problem and there is no solution. We are also the solution. I think we can choose to appreciate and value different things like you're talking about. Just like Jesus had to tell Samuel, right? Do not look on the next king like anybody else would in the world. I'm going to select somebody that you wouldn't normally think should be king. And I think that's the challenge to us. When we are either looking at people, or we looking for churches or looking for pastors, we need to be using our nose to smell if someone has the aroma of Christ.
I do think, though, beyond that, it's the responsibility of people who are sort of the gatekeepers to platforms. Like, if you're the one organizing the conference, or you're the editor at a publisher, or you're deciding who to put on the radio or whatever, to not just put the superstar up there who's going to sell a lot of books or attract a big audience, but to do the hard work of determining and discerning who has the maturity and the character and the gravity of soul to bear the responsibility of the platform we are giving you. And I don't think we do a very good job of that, and especially a lot of the evangelical world. We put people up there who are superstars because they're dynamic and charismatic, and then we're all shocked and horrified when they burn out because they couldn't carry the weight of the platform.
Right. So, Sky, do you think there's hope for us, even though we're not as hot as we once were?
I hope so. That partly that's why we're on a podcast, so no one has to look at us if you don't want to.
You know what, you guys? I have to say, you do that. You walk the walk. You're not just talking, you walk the walk. You bring on people that do smell like Jesus and feel like Jesus and talking the message of Jesus. And people that listen have discovered. I mean, I watch it all the time on Twitter. They're saying, I now bought these books or read this thing because you brought this person on the podcast. And I want to speak for those people and say thank you. Thank you for reaching out and finding those people that get lost in the noise because they're not today's latest flavor.
Well, thanks, Kristian. I appreciate that. Okay, last story. This is a story from Religion and Politics website, religionandpolitics.com, I think. Why the partisan divide? Because the U.S. is becoming more secular and more religious. Interesting story. The data suggests that our national divide is deeper than just knee-jerk partisanship. It involves a confluence of religio-geographic trends in the United States that all but guarantee the kind of political gridlock we saw manifest this month at the ballot box. The United States is not a purely secular nation, nor is it a fully religious one. The country stands out among its international peers as distinctly balanced. So they actually compared America, the religious breakdown of America, to 11 other developed Western countries. And we are really unique. Slightly less than 1/3 of the U.S. population is deeply religious. At the same time, 1/3 is almost fully secular, never participating in any sort of religious practice. And then the final third is nominally religious. And there is no other country that they looked at that breaks down so evenly, where 1/3 of the country is very religious and 1/3 of the country virtually irreligious. And they believe that is a huge part of the reason we don't understand each other. Also, it's more and more divided by geography. So the third that's religious lives in certain areas of the country where they're only around other people that are religious. And the third that's secular live in areas of the country, in big cities and, coastal areas, where everyone else is really secular. So we can't even understand. We don't recognize that there are so many people that are different than us.
And where do all the nominal people live? In the suburbs?
All the nominal people they float around in the suburbs, I think. Sociologists Michael Hoot and Claude Fisher have published research suggesting that an aversion to the religious right's involvement, this is why so much of the country has secularized lately. The United States, since 2007, the United States has shown the largest move away from religion of any country for which we have data. So more people have left religion since 2007 in the United States than any other country. And they believe it's because of people that were more moderately religious have been turned off by the religious right's involvement in politics. So organized religion gained influence by espousing a conservative social agenda that led liberals and young people who already had weak attachment to organized religion to drop the identification altogether. The same trends seem to push some towards secularism may also help crystallize faith in others. So indeed, even as the nation is becoming more secular, in another sense, it's also becoming more religious. So people that are religious are becoming more religious, and more people are becoming secular and becoming more secular. So we're getting pushed further and further to the extremes. Their conclusion is the only way out of the partisanship we have is to recognize how pluralistic we are. To say, wow, for the people on one side to say, those are actual people on the other side, and they too are American citizens, and to do that on both sides. It may be that recognizing the nation's religious and secular demographics as both stable, in other words, the religious people aren't going away, and the secular people aren't going away, and balanced, in other words, they're about the same amount of each. could broker a kind of detente that recognizes cooperation and the search for genuine understanding is the only productive path forward. What do you think about that?
I don't disagree. I think what has helped that détente, to use their word, in the past was a level of shared media and we had shared media, shared cultural experiences, and a shared enemy. So in the Cold War, it was, we have our differences. We may be secular or religious. We might be conservative or progressive, but we are all anti-Soviet. And so that bonded us. And that led to shared experiences. I've been watching the Right Stuff mini-series on Disney Plus, which is just fantastic. It's really, really good. But it's a reminder of how the country came together to watch the launch of an Apollo mission or a Mercury mission, or I remember as a kid watching the space shuttle. Like, we had those shared experiences, and we have fewer and fewer of those today.
Now all we have is the Masked Singer.
Right. I mean, we're all in our own little TikTok worlds on our devices rather than having, it's a joke I've said in my family, but like, we're all going to watch the same screen the way God intended a family to be. Like, that just doesn't happen much anymore. So shared enemy, shared media, which shared experience, which then results from a shared media. There weren't that many options. There were a handful of network stations. There were a handful of things everyone watched. We all watched Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer at Christmas time. We all watched the Super Bowl. We all watched the Ten Commandments on Easter weekend. And now, with the proliferation of media, we're fragmented, we don't have those things. So you add all that together, and the détente, the things that bind us together as a culture, aren't there anymore. And it accentuates the differences rather than mitigates them. So, and I don't know how you reverse that. Unless you come up with a really compelling enemy.
Yeah, well, you'd think a global pandemic might be a compelling enemy, but apparently that's not true.
Viruses are invisible. They don't have big bushy eyebrows and speak with an accent.
Well, if we were getting insight and video into a hospital and into a morgue, and if we were having close-up encounters of what people on the front lines are seeing every day, that would then become a common enemy. I think the problem is now it is so remote and nobody can see anything and nobody trusts anything. So,
yeah, I think what gives me hope, and where I think the solution probably starts, is very religious people who live among very secular people, and our leaders are voices. So, I'm thinking of Tim Keller, I'm thinking of John Tyson, who are both, very compelling voices for Christian belief living in New York City. And what you would never hear from Christian voices living entirely in secular environments is this fear of, they're coming to get us. They're coming to get us, because they're friends with highly secular people, and they're not coming to get them. So where you hear that fear is isolated religious voices that don't actually have atheist or agnostic friends, that don't have friends, on the far left. So we need to hear less from isolated voices. Now, the problem on the secular side is you don't have secular voices that live in, deep rural religious America, because why would they live there? There's no jobs there. That's not what they, you want to be a journalist, you want to be on TV. You're not going to move to Idaho.
Well, and there's no secular mission that says it's a compelling and worthwhile effort to live among people who are different than you. There is a Christian mission that says that, which is why a John Tyson or a Tim Keller moves to Manhattan.
So I think it rests on us to initiate detente, if there is detente. It rests on believers, and it rests on believers that probably have more exposure to the secular point of view and have more secular friends who can actually reach out, and there are people to reach out to. Because I don't think it's going to happen. It's not going to happen from rural America to reach out to the big cities, and it's not going to happen from secularists in the big cities to reach out to rural America. So I think John Tyson is our only hope.
I also want to mention David Swanson. He was on our podcast before.
Yes.
David Swanson intentionally moved into, inner city Chicago, and he's doing incredible work there. And
wait a minute. I have to correct something I just said. I just spoke from an entirely white perspective. African-American pastors are also in big city. I'm thinking of Charlie Dates. Charlie Dates is right downtown Chicago in a very secular environment as well. So the Black church, I'm going to add that on. I do think the more, over the last couple of months that the Black church plays a key role in American Christianity going forward, because it hasn't been co-opted by one side or the other. It has an independent voice, and leaders like Charlie Dates or some of the other African American devout evangelical Christians that we've had on are in a unique place. I'm Viola Davis, Devon Franklin, Hollywood producer. These are Christian voices in the secular world with secular friends that have an invitation to speak freely. And you see that more out of the Black church than you do out of white evangelicalism.
I don't want to disparage white evangelical leaders, but I agree. I think the future of evangelicalism and maybe the future of the church in general in the United States is going to heavily rely on African American, Latino American, and Asian American leaders. And they have a perspective and a skill set that is needed in our pluralistic moment that a lot of white leaders just frankly don't have. Not for any fault of their own. They just haven't been in environments to experience the diversity and to know how to navigate that in a way that these other leaders have.
What about leaders that are half Indian?
Yeah, the ethnically ambiguous ones.
Yeah,
maybe
they're good too. Sorry, Christian.
That's okay. And I want to say from personal perspective, when I lived in Mississippi, I did prison ministry with an African-American pastor named Wade Wortham, who was the most unbelievable, godly man. And so I watched him baptize these young women in jail, and I decided I wanted to go to his church. And I went to several other African-American churches in the deep south of Mississippi. I've never been so warmly welcomed and embraced as I was in those churches. And so I would encourage people to go and visit and see what it's like there, because I agree with you, Skye. I think there's a lot to be learned from other diverse communities. And I do think we have to be intentional about finding those and making those relationships happen.
All right, cool. Do we have a guest?
We do have a guest. And I'll probably tell everybody who that guest is in a moment in the middle-y bit of our podcast.
Okay, you'll find out in the middle-y bit who the guest is. So what did we learn today? We learned about pigeons, and that don't just walk by a pigeon.
You need to sing.
Right,
so what did we learn today? How's that
could be? And so what we have learned applies to our lives today, and God has a lot to say in his book. Like, don't pass by a pigeon. You could be leaving $2 million on the side of the road. Do pass by a hot pastor, because they are headed for trouble, unless it's Skye and I. And then, we've been hot for so long that we're inoculated to our own hotness, and it's no longer a temptation. And then finally, we really need you pastors in big cities to lead us out of this huge partisan divide in America and show us that the two sides are not out to kill each other and can actually work together and ultimately worship together, and the African-American church. All right. So
Amen.
There you go. Thanks for coming. We will talk to you guys next week.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone. For many of us, the Nativity story is one of the most familiar in the Bible. It's a story we tell our kids, and it's one that we come back to year after year after year, which is partly why it makes it more difficult during this Advent season to really discover something new about the birth of Jesus or to read Scripture from a different point of view. But that's exactly what we're going to try to do this month in With God Daily, my daily devotional for people who hate daily devotionals. We've started a new series called Christmas Psalms. We're looking at the Psalms through the point of view of the Nativity story. For example, Psalm 4 finds David talking about anger, and we juxtapose that with the way Herod's anger leads to great evil and destruction. Other Psalms are directly messianic and are actually quoted in the New Testament. This won't be your typical Advent devotional, but if that's what you're looking for, I encourage you to go check it out at withgoddaily.com. A donation of any amount will get you signed up to receive the devotional 5 days a week, and you'll also be able to download the mobile app and get access to all of the archive series, as well as the audio devotional, which you can listen to rather than read. As always, if you can't afford to make a donation right now, you can still sign up for free by going to withgoddaily.com and contacting us directly. I really believe it's important to make this devotional available for free to those who can't afford it. In fact, we even give the devotional away to people in prison and on death row. But that's only possible because some subscribers donate generously to make it available to others for free. And at the end of the year, if you're thinking about your giving and you'd like to contribute to the expansion of With God Daily, again, you can go to withgoddaily.com and make a one-time donation of any amount. I hope you find encouragement and inspiration through the Psalms this December, and hopefully through With God Daily all year long, you discover what a deeper, more meaningful relationship with God can really look like. And thank you to everyone who's made this ministry possible. A few weeks ago, we had pastor and sociology professor Ryan Burge on the podcast to talk about the outcome of the 2020 election. And one of the things he said really caught my ear. He talked about how white evangelicals are pretty much in lockstep with the platform of the Republican Party, with very few exceptions. But one of those exceptions was the legalization of drugs. Both political parties have been moving toward a posture of ending the war on drugs and either decriminalizing or flat out legalizing many of those substances. It's a view that's been growing in popularity, but not as quickly among white evangelicals. Right around the time Ryan Burge was on our show, I read an interesting op-ed by Bonnie Kristian, arguing from a biblical and Christian point of view why we should end the war on drugs. So I thought it'd be great to have her back on the podcast to talk about her point of view and discuss why the war on drugs has been a failure, but how there's still a lot of ambiguity, particularly from a Christian point of view, about what to do after the war on drugs. Bonnie Kristian is a columnist at Christianity Today and a contributing editor at The Week. She's also a fellow at Defense Priorities, and she's written a book called A Flexible Faith, Rethinking What It Means to Follow Jesus Today. She's been on the show before. I'm delighted to have her back to talk about this important issue, and we're going to link to her editorial in the show notes below. Here's my conversation with Bonnie Kristian. Bonnie Kristian, welcome back to the Holy Post.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me again.
Okay, so since the last time we spoke, and I can't remember when that was, you've started writing columns for Christianity Today. And you wrote one on November 5th, which is, 2 days after the election, when things were still somewhat ambiguous about the outcome of at least the presidential contest. But your column's about how in a number of states, Arizona, Mississippi, Montana, New Jersey, and South Dakota, there were initiatives on the ballot to, in some form, decriminalize drug use. And everything from marijuana to hallucinogenic mushrooms in some of these states. And what's remarkable is in every single state, red and blue, they all passed. So that triggered you to write a column about the war on drugs and why you think it's time to move beyond it. So I want to dive into this because this is one area that I assumed Christians, at least conservative Christians, were not really on board. But you're saying more of them are. What do you think has changed? Why are Christians changing their views about drug legalization?
I think the biggest change probably comes from sort of what I called a prudential case, which is what I made in the article, which was not about like are drugs actually fine and good for Christians to use, and it's not about even the sort of principled case of like, is it legitimate for the government to prohibit this like as a matter of individual liberty? But really the prudential case is about like, is this working? Is it achieving our goals of reducing drug abuse and addiction, and overdose deaths and the really destructive consequences that this use can have? Is the prohibitionary, the drug war approach, is it working to reduce that? And the answer after 50 plus years of prohibition is it is absolutely not. And it's easier, I think, for people, especially coming from a more conservative political space, to think about this with milder drugs like marijuana. And so, we've seen that's sort of like the early edge of this, where that has been legalized and decriminalized far more than any of the other drugs that it was quite a new thing what happened in this past election in just a couple areas. But it's like the case across the board that we've been at this for half a century. We have spent trillions of dollars. We have, ruined lives with long prison sentences and massive growth of the state in all sorts of areas that are, mass surveillance, mass incarceration. It's this huge program. And we've ended up, after all of that difficulty and expense, we have ended up with record high drug abuse levels by both historical standards within the United States and by international standards compared to other, similar countries around the world today.
Okay, so in the article, you compare the war on drugs to prohibition back in the 1920s. And obviously that was largely driven by Christians who saw the scourge of alcoholism in the country, spousal abuse, lots of other problems that alcohol was causing. The teetotalers got active, they mobilized, they engaged Washington, D.C., eventually passed the amendment to make alcohol illegal in the hopes of making a more moral society. And, we got gangster movies and all the other kind of black market work of alcohol and the bootleggers and things like that. Is there a case to be made that the same thing has happened with illicit drugs? And if so, what is the world of legalized drugs going to look like beyond just marijuana?
It's an incredibly similar scenario. And this is one reason why it's always baffled me a little bit that we've done the drug war for so long when we figured out so quickly how bad alcohol prohibition worked. And I think a big reason for that difference, why we stuck with one whereas the other we gave up on after about a decade, is just that alcohol use was more widely accepted, whereas drug use, a lot of drugs like marijuana back in the earlier part of the 20th century were very much associated by the sort of people who were in power back then, in political power, mainly white dudes. These drugs were associated with outgroups, racial outgroups, Mexicans, Black people, and poverty. And so there was this sense of like when we did alcohol prohibition, it affected all of us. When we do the drug war, it's only affecting these other people who are not like us. And I think the new increasing understanding that, Black people and white people in America use marijuana at pretty much identical rates. Now that we have the current opioid epidemic, that's been significantly something that's affected white people as compared to, we think of like the crack epidemic in the 1980s is much more associated with Black communities. And so I think that growing understanding that drug use is something that Americans do across racial lines, across class lines, has helped people in more recent years to understand that, this is actually affecting all of us. This isn't just something that harms a small group of the population. But so yes, back to your initial question, they are very comparable. And one of the things that I quoted in my CT article was a line that the very conservative economist Milton Friedman said back in 1991, sort of the height of the Reagan first President Bush drug war surge that they did. And he said, if you look at the drug war from a purely economic point of view, the role of the government is to protect the drug cartel. And what he meant was that when you have an extremely lucrative, very valuable market and you prohibit legal participation in that market, anyone who's law-abiding and doesn't want to take on the risk and doesn't want to potentially commit the violence that it requires to get around that law, those people say, well, I'm out, I can't do this, right? And so you're left with only people who are not law-abiding, who are willing to commit violence, who are willing to take the risks to get around the law enforcement. You're left with those people dominating the market, and the government prevents them from having any competition. So they can go in, they can make huge amounts of money, and the sort of potentially legitimate business owners who, want to make sure that they're selling things responsibly, that they're not poisoning people, that they're not facilitating addiction. We're thinking about things like small marijuana dispensaries that now exist in some states where this is legal. When you ban those things, you are left with just the violent cartels and the situation that we have today, where there's enormous violence, and they make a lot of money, and the government, on the one hand, participates in that violence by trying to prohibit it, but on the other hand, keeps them from having competition, and so ensures that they will continue doing what they're doing by making it such an attractive black market.
So it's the case for, rather than criminalizing it and creating a black market, legalize and regulate it, and therefore have more means of managing the problem rather than just keeping it in the shadows. One of the issues you didn't directly address in your article, but you just mentioned briefly, some folks have criticized the current movement toward legalization as really rooted in racism. And what I mean by that is when illicit drugs were ravaging poor communities and communities of color, our approach was generally criminalize it, put people in jail who are addicts, certainly those who are dealers. But now that the opioid epidemic is ravaging white communities largely, there's this shift in posture away from criminalization toward legalization and treatment, which is another way of saying when this is hurting Black people, it's a crime. When it's hurting white people, it's a disease. Is there validity to that criticism? And should we allow that to disrupt this movement toward legalization?
Is it a fact that that correlation exists? Yes. And should it exist? No, right? Like people should be able to understand that something is harmful even when it's harming people who don't look like you. And it would be ideal if many members of the white majority in this country did not need to see how the drug war hurts people who are personally close to them and resemble them physically to come to that realization. But the fact is that, like, I don't want to stop what we're doing because some people didn't get here in an ideal way, right? I think to say, well, some people were hurt by this, so we need to hurt other people too to make it fair. That's not a movement towards justice. It's certainly not a movement towards mercy. I think it's also the case that the drug war is still harming, and in many cases disproportionately harming people who are not white. And so putting the brakes on it for the sake of inflicting current injustice on white people because of past injustice on Black people, that's going to hurt Black people right now as well. And so, even if some of our allies in this maybe didn't get here because of some position of ideological purity and consistency, they got here because they had to actually see the effects for themselves in their own community. That's not a reason to kick them out, because the fact is they got here and we still need to make this change.
Okay, so let's go back to that ideological purity idea for a second. You may not be aware, but before the election, we put out a video that got a lot of attention about abortion. And the argument was essentially, what are the strategies that actually reduce abortions short of making it completely illegal? And one of the most consistent reactions we got from some Christians was any state, any government that sanctions abortion is complicit in evil. And therefore, regardless of whether or not it impacts the actual rate of abortion, we must make it illegal because it sends a moral message about what is righteous and what is not. Some Christians might make a similar argument about illicit drugs. I mean, to be fair, there is a difference between marijuana and cocaine or crack cocaine or heroin, just as there's a difference between alcohol and some other drugs, which do irreparable damage at times. You can have a glass of wine and not be seriously impaired. I don't think that's necessarily true of taking a hit of heroin. So there are people who believe some of these drugs are just inherently dangerous, damaging, dehumanizing, and evil. Is there a case to be made that a government that sanctions such substances is participating in what is ultimately just evil, and therefore we, regardless of the practicality, we shouldn't be entertaining ideas of legalizing these substances?
Yeah, I would respond to that two ways. Well, the first, before I get to that, is I don't disagree about something like heroin. Nothing that I've argued is about, oh, well, heroin's actually not that bad. It is that bad, and we don't want people using it. But the two things I would say is, one, that there is a important difference between abortion and drug use, which is that abortion is something that you are doing to another person, and indeed that's the fundamental basis of the pro-life position, that there is taking of a human life, and drug use is something you are doing to yourself. And so that's an important difference. One has a victim, an external victim, the other does not. And then the second thing that I would say is, it does go back to that question of what actually works to prevent things. And yeah, I understand that argument maybe doesn't work for those people, right? Like that making things legal, even if that does actually end up with fewer people using heroin, they still want to take the firm stand against it. And so in that case, I would go back to the idea of an external victim, and that things that the government is rightfully involved in prohibiting, what we call crimes have external victims. Things that only harm ourselves, those are vices, and I would argue those are not properly the subject of the criminal justice system. And of course, in the case of drug use, and this is another contrast from abortion, addiction has an element of sickness. It is not simply a choice. There, as I wrote in the CT piece, there are elements of moral agency, there are elements of heredity, there are elements of illness, and so that is a major distinction between, when you have a chemical dependency on heroin, that's something that has happened in your body that is there day in and day out. That is not the same as abortion, where it's you're making a one-time decision to have this procedure done and then it's over. And so in a lot of ways, I just think the analogy is not great. There are key differences that strain that comparison.
Let me play devil's advocate for a second.
Sure.
I think there are plenty of spouses and children of addicts who would argue that addiction does have an external victim, that there are people who are affected beyond the person who is addicted themselves. And even during the era of prohibition and the movement to make alcohol illegal, many of the arguments were the effect that alcoholism has on women, on families, on communities. So indeed, the person who is addicted to drugs is choosing, and maybe perhaps initially a lot of times they don't choose, they're addicted for other reasons, but they are harming themselves, but that harm is not limited to themselves. There is a communal dimension to addiction, which costs society something. It costs us in productivity, it costs us in criminal justice issues, it costs us in healthcare and treatment. So you could argue I shouldn't be forced by the government to wear my seatbelt, because if I get in a car accident, I'm only going to be harming myself. And yet we have seatbelt laws throughout the country because it's understood that it affects everybody's insurance rates and first responders and things like that. So therefore the government says you have to wear a seatbelt. What's the difference between that and the government saying you cannot have access to these substances?
I think at that point we've expanded from the pure case of principle and morality. We've expanded to what are the practical effects. And if we're going to talk about practical effects, then I get to bring in the fact that the practical effect of criminalizing this stuff is that it makes it more difficult for people to get the treatment that they need that would prevent them from doing those harms to their family. When you make something illegal like this, people use it in secret. They use worse versions of it in secret. They do not seek treatment because they are afraid they will end up in jail. They abuse their spouses in the shadows because the whole thing is draped in this cloak of secrecy and fear, and treating it as a crime instead of an illness which has elements of bad decisions, evil decisions, but treating it as a crime is worse at a practical level. And so if we're going to bring in those practical effects of where we're looking beyond the very narrow choice of taking drugs and comparing that to having an abortion, then I think it's not playing fair at that point to not bring in the practical aspects.
Great. Let's talk about kind of the more lower altitude issues. You're a mom, I believe, right?
I am. I have twin 18-month-old boys.
That's right. Last time we talked, you were doing it during a nap time, I think, for the kids. So
sounds about right.
My kids are teenagers, and I'm living in the same community more or less where I grew up. And when I was a teenager in this community, like many places, teenagers drank alcohol. Teenagers smoked cigarettes. But I saw very infrequent use of drugs like marijuana. It was out there, but it wasn't kind of in your face. Today, it is everywhere. I mean, I've heard stories from my kids about being in the football stands at a Friday night game, and they're telling me most of the kids in the stands, while they're in the stands, are vaping marijuana. And they're doing it in the middle of school during the day because of vape pens. The smell is different. It can be covered up. It's very subtle. They're getting high all the time. And there is no social stigma on it whatsoever, because it's just not, it's the way we used to think about tobacco is the way they think about marijuana. It's not illegal. Yeah, I shouldn't be doing it as a teenager, but I can get access to it and it's fine. And one of the struggles I have as a parent now is I can't just say to my kids, hey, society has pretty much universally said this is a terrible thing to do, to the point where it's illegal. Now it's just mom and dad saying this is a terrible thing to do and you shouldn't. Is there a case to be made that we lose some of the moral imperative against these things when we decriminalize it?
I mean, I think if you're relying on the government to tell you what is moral in your personal life, as a parent, if I were doing that, I think I would feel I'd already failed.
Well, hold on.
I mean, there's so many things that are legal, right, that are wrong.
Yeah, but we're not saying we're relying on the government for this. We're saying we believe this is wrong. And it's not just mom and dad who are saying this, but as a society, there is a collective agreement that this is wrong. And you would be violating not just what mom and dad say, but what society at large says makes for a bad decision or a bad life. There's some weight behind it.
I mean, yes, I suppose. I don't know. I guess it's never really occurred to me as a parent, and granted, you know, you have done a lot more stages of parenting than I have. It's never occurred to me from a parenting perspective that I would use society to back myself up. You know, I think I can make a pretty solid biblical case, and that was about half of that CT article, a pretty solid biblical case against using certainly any drugs that produce significant intoxication that are likely to lead to addiction. But there are just so many things that our society says are right that, you know, I don't want my children doing. And so, I think as Christians, we have to assume that there will be a lot of things that society condones that we don't. That sort of just seems like the standard Christian life, that to have a pretty significant differing opinion from the general social consensus, unless we get a whole lot better about conversion and discipleship than we ever have been.
Well, I mean, I'm pushing you on these questions because I know they're the ones our audience is going to be asking.
Sure.
The reason I invited you on with this article is because I thought it was compelling, and I'm on board with you. One last push in regarding what you just said.
Sure.
I agree with you that like so many of the issues we're facing as Christians in the society come down to our effectiveness at discipleship. And at least over the last number of years, I have not been widely encouraged that we're doing a very good job at that. So I think that's part of the angst about decriminalizing some of these substances. Is I agree with you, we should be doing a better job discipling our communities and our kids in this, but our repeated failure to do that in all sorts of areas, not just having to do with substance abuse. I guess I'm saying my hesitation is the church isn't doing a very good job. And here's one less tool in our toolbox that's being taken away with the legalization of these substances.
And I recognize that, but I would also say, you know, one of my colleagues at The Week, where I'm a contributing editor, wrote an article in response to the Oregon ballot measure in particular, which functionally decriminalized very small scale possession and use of any drug, which is like unprecedented, you know, at a statewide scale in the United States. And he opened his article with something to the effect, he's a very conservative Catholic. He opened his article with something to the effect of like, you know, Republicans lost pretty badly in Oregon last night. Normally I would tell them to, you know, maybe enjoy a beer, but who knows, maybe now they'll do heroin. And I had to laugh at this because, you know, no one woke up in Oregon the day after the election and thought, all right, gonna go take that heroin now. Like I never would have considered heroin before, but now that hard drug sounds, it's time to start. That's just not how these decisions are made. And I think this is a big lesson that alcohol prohibition taught us, which is that the number of people who are making there was that brief period when alcohol prohibition started that you did see a decline in alcohol use. But by the time that amendment was repealed, alcohol use had gone back or higher to the levels that we were at before. And the reality is that outside that marginal effect, maybe at the immediate period after something is banned, and among a few people who are, I guess, just real scared of getting caught, most people are not making these decisions because of the legal status of these drugs.
Right.
And again, the thing that I always want to reiterate is that we've been doing this for half a century. We have record high abuse and addiction rates compared to our own history and compared to other comparable countries in terms of wealth and culture and that sort of thing around the world. Looking at places in Europe, places where this stuff is already decriminalized, it's much better. You have a far lower rate of people dying overdose deaths. And so, does the church need to get a whole lot better about discipleship? Yes. But I think the number of kids that are being prevented from using drugs by the laws is going to be fairly small compared to the number of kids that are being prevented by having some greater moral compass than what's legal and what's not.
Yeah, to paraphrase Jeff Goldblum, vice finds a way.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about something that you don't address in the article, but I'm very curious about, because no doubt these laws are going to continue to be overturned, and we're going to continue to see legalization or at least decriminalization of a lot of these substances. But what bothers me about it is it's not coupled with a corresponding reallocation of resources. So if we're going to decriminalize some of these substances, don't we need to take some of the funding that is currently going to criminal justice and law enforcement in the war on drugs and reallocate that money toward treatment and healthcare for people who are addicted? Because so much money is going right now to fighting the war on drugs towards punitive and police action. But how do you decriminalize it without moving some of that? It's kind of the defund the police thing a little bit. But there's a lot less interest in doing that because it's seen as a liberal talking point, even though a lot of Republicans now support the decriminalization of drugs, but they're not willing to shift resources accordingly. What do we do about that?
Yeah, and it was interesting with the Oregon ballot initiative that I mentioned. There were major medical sort of groups, nurses unions or what have you, on both sides of it. And the ones that were supporting it were saying this will make it easier for people to get treatment. And the ones that were opposing it were saying, yes, but we don't actually have things set up to provide that treatment, even though we want to. We think this is a good idea, but exactly the argument you made, we haven't prepared for it. And I think that is an important thing. And if we look at the models of something like Portugal, which has decriminalized all drugs for quite a while now. I think it's about two decades. They made that sort of thing available. I believe they even have supervised use of some drugs. Like, if you're going to do it, we would rather you do it under medical care, sort of thing. I very much doubt that would ever fly in the United States, at least in the near future, because that does come to the point of you're walking the line at that point of, are you facilitating it or not, right? But yeah, this is definitely something that needs to be addressed as we're moving in this direction. Are we going to change how resources are allocated? And I think that will be a conversation that will become more pressing of necessity. Unfortunately, it's maybe not happening in tandem the way that it should. Though I also think that we haven't, outside of Oregon, gotten to the point of decriminalizing, these harder drugs where that becomes a more pressing issue than it is with just marijuana.
In my own community here, I live in Wheaton. There was a vacant medical office not too far from my neighborhood that's been empty for probably a couple of years. And a group came in that wanted to convert the building into an inpatient drug treatment center. And it just riled the community because nobody wanted a drug treatment center in their neighborhood. And it's not really in our neighborhood, but it's close enough. And eventually, I don't know what happened in the details of the policy or legislation or whatever the amendment was they needed to rezone the thing, but it got defeated. And at the same time, we have seen a massive escalation of drug abuse and addiction in our community, not just kids smoking marijuana, but opioids and other things. So I wonder if it's a microcosm of what we're facing as a society, where we are seeing increases in addiction, more people realizing the right answer is not criminalizing it, not putting these people in jail, but seeking treatment. But then nobody actually wants to do the hard work of having treatment in their neighborhood or paying for it out of their tax dollars or reallocating money away from the police toward treatment. So that's my concern, is we're kind of we're succeeding on one side and failing on the other. And are we just changing the predicament from a war on drugs to a pandemic of drugs with no real treatment plan?
Yeah. I mean, so I would say, well, a couple of things. One, it's very reminiscent of what happens with housing, where people say, we want affordable housing, but please don't build it on my block.
Right.
And so there's sort of like the NIMBYism, not in my backyard, that happens with drug treatment as well. We want people to get treatment, but please keep it out of sight. I think maybe some of that will improve as people continue to realize that it is something that can affect you and your community. And maybe, if your kid gets addicted to opioids, you would actually love to have that nearby drug treatment facility where you can go and visit him, and he can, or if it's not inpatient, he can go access that easily and have that resource available to him. So I think there's that. But I also think that this idea that as these things are legalized, there will be an explosion of use. Again, that's not what the data suggests from where it has happened elsewhere and from our own history with prohibition. There's sort of, and whatever the cause of this, I don't know if we can explain it, but there's sort of a baseline of abuse of these substances in our society. And I don't know if that baseline will significantly budge with legalization. If it does, I think it would go down, not up. But again, addiction it has elements of illness and heredity, and those genetic elements, for example, those don't disappear no matter what the policy is. People are still going to feel that like biological tug to use these substances once they've been sampled, and that won't change. But it also means it won't change in the worst direction. Again, those people in Oregon didn't decide to try heroin the day after the election.
Where I totally agree with you is that the war on drugs has been an abject failure. There's no doubt about that. The evidence is overwhelming. Where I still remain concerned, and maybe I'm just too much a father of teenagers here, is, and you may well be aware of this, there has been a massive rise in mental health issues with young adults and teenagers. Some people say it's largely attributed to social media and smartphones, and Jonathan Haidt's written about this a lot. Suicide rates among teen girls has gone up like 200%. You have all these mental health challenges, and a lot of people trying to figure out what's behind that. We can argue about it all day long, but when you have a generation of young people with more severe and acute mental health disorder, including depression, at the same time that you have widespread legalization of drugs, including marijuana, are we creating a perfect storm for a generation of abuse, drug abuse, without then adequately preparing for the necessary treatment that this generation is going to need? Because we haven't allocated the resources away from criminal justice war on drugs to treatment and mental health and medical care. That's my concern.
Yeah.
Is I'm not against ending the war on drugs, but I have not yet seen a really convincing model for what we do going forward.
Sure. I respond to that a couple ways. One is that, pushing back on something you mentioned earlier, marijuana use may be more less hidden among teenagers right now, but it's actually fairly flat over the past 30 years. It hasn't spiked, even if we're hearing more about it in terms of like what the collecting data on this is difficult, right? But you would think as attitudes liberalize, teenagers would be more willing to tell pollsters if they're using it, not less. And so we would see a spike if indeed it was going up. And the reality is we mostly don't. We even have some data in the first few years after Colorado legalized back in like 2013, or if it was 2012, somewhere around there, teen pot use dropped perhaps because once it's no longer forbidden, it's a little less appealing.
I know my experience is just anecdotal.
Sure.
But I'll be surprised if those numbers don't change in the coming data sets in the next few years.
They might. It's early yet. We don't have a lot of data on that. It's also the case that the past 20 to 40 years of teen drinking has declined. Teen alcohol use was up in the north of 60% in the 70s and 80s. Now it's down about a third. And so, or to about a third of use. And so, there is a huge mental health crisis among teenagers, and I am inclined to the social media explanation. I think it's very difficult to overstate how deleterious teenagers having cell phones is, especially unfettered access to these websites or to these networks. I also think, though, that there is data to suggest that there's a trade of harms that are happening, that kids who stay home laying on their bed chatting with their friends on Snapchat and using Instagram, they are actually not so much out there drinking and using drugs.
Right.
And in fact, this is also the case with video games. You can find data that shows as video game use goes up, these other ills go down, the more social ills. And so you get a different set of mental health effects. And I tend to think that the mental health effects of your teenager having some beers on Friday night are probably less than the mental health effects of your teenager spending 7 hours a day on his phone. Not that I want the beers on Friday night, right? But if I have to pick. And so, I would say we're in early days yet. And even, I don't anticipate that this stuff is ever going to be legal for teenagers. We have a drinking age. I don't think there's ever going to not be a drug use age. Even if it's legalized, it's not going to be 14-year-olds have at it.
Right. I agree. It's but there is access issues and other dimensions of this, which
there are. But is it easier? Is it easier when to be 14 and to go into a legitimate above board marijuana dispensary that has to worry about what the cops are going to the cops can come in and they can interact with them and they have surveillance cameras and they're subject to regulations, or is it easier to get it from the dealer in your high school?
Right. Speaking as a former teenage boy, I can attest that virtually every bad thing I ever did was at a friend's house who had an older brother. So it's that, there are those channels. Okay. Last question before we wrap up. You talk about this a little bit in your piece. What's your advice to the church and church leaders as we enter into this new era of legalized drugs? How do we need to talk about and engage this issue differently in our local church communities?
Well, I think one we've already touched on, which is the question of discipleship. And I think this is important. When you have an opioid epidemic, this is important, whether things are legal or not, making sure discipleship and also pastoral care, right? So as much as you're saying, don't start this, I think for church leaders, it's also very important to be educated about what are the signs of this. I think if someone in the congregation is struggling with opioids, hopefully a pastor would be able to recognize that, to identify that, even if the person is not mentioning it. Maybe they would be able to spot some signs of behavior, of physical health or what have you, to help that person get care and get not just medical care, but to get the spiritual care that they need. And then the other thing I think is there's a way to frame the situation as an opportunity. Things like supporting that clinic you described, supporting that coming in, looking for opportunities to help people. If people who are dealing with addiction are able to come into the light and to say, I need help, well, then there should be Christians there to say okay, I can provide that to you. It potentially is a huge opportunity when you don't have to go and try to find people who are dealing with addiction hidden away, trying to conceal their problem. If they're willing to bring it to you, then we should be willing to receive that and to do what we can.
Well, Bonnie, thank you for coming back on the show and for this excellent piece. We'll link it in the show notes. It's called, as I scroll back up, Christians Like Me Believe We Must End the Drug War to Win It. Came out November 5th, and I know you're going to continue to write for CT as well as The Week. Any other books or projects you want to make sure people are aware of?
Oh, not at this time. Something about having 18-month-old twins makes it real difficult to get together a book proposal.
Oh, I don't understand because I don't have twins. I never had twins, but I wrote my first book when my kids were very, very little, and that book was written largely between 9 p.m. and midnight over the course of a year and a half.
Yeah.
When the house was quiet. But
not really functional by then, so yeah.
But well, I'm glad you are functional enough to write these great pieces and keep us thinking. And you're welcome back anytime. I look forward to the next time you're with us.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad to come back.
The Holy Post Podcast is a production of Phil Vischer Enterprises, that's Phil's company, and Sky Pilot Media, that's Sky's company. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/Holy Post. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary plus ukulele and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, and more.